I think the thing that spurred me further along was conceptualizing a $1 as 1 second and then working out the difference in order of magnitudes from $1 million being 10 days to $1 billion being 32 years. It means that when you print $1 billion, you're basically you're mortgaging the future of the next generation already in $1 billion.
Hey everyone, welcome to Bitcoin for Professionals. We have Justin Chin on the line and my co-host Harris Irfan. How are you guys doing?
Very good, thanks.
Good, Ralph. Thanks.
Justin, it's great to have you. You have quite a unique background. Not a lot of people come from your background, especially within the Bitcoin space. So, to start things off, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've done in the past, where your area of expertise is, and just, high level kind of career journey.
Okay, so I guess the most relevant part is banking and finance. So I got into banking, oh, geez, it's close to 15 years ago now, and started right at the bottom in a part-time role in a call center, servicing small and micro businesses, mums and dads, and it was actually really enjoyable. It gave you a real sense of what was happening on what they call sort of Main Street before you sort of get exposed into the, high finance of like Wall Street or what that involves. I did that for a couple of years, being a relationship manager for small businesses. I got to look after all sorts of clients from every sort of business you can imagine, and then got promoted to corporate or mid-market, and that was more property development, leverage finance. And after a couple of years there, got promoted again to institutional banking, and that was the introduction to energy. And initially, it was looking after regulated utilities, and that was adjacent to renewable energy and project finance. It sort of went from there, and I got to work for the largest bank in Australia doing that, and then was fortunate enough to move to London with the same bank to do that job over there as well. And then in more recent years, moved to an asset manager. So the lens sort of shifted from credit and counterparty risk and underwriting risk more to a different sort of underwriting risk where you're on the equity side and you're looking at the investment risk that were in these renewable energy projects.
Did you did you deliberately move across to renewable energy, or was it something you just fell into after doing project finance? Because presumably doing project finance for Australia's largest bank, you would have done big power projects and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fortunate how things turn out in circumstance. So institutional banking for that Australian bank is divided into industry specializations. And initially I went for a job in the telco sector, but as it turned out, I ended up getting a job in the regulated utilities team. And because that was adjacent to energy, that's how I got exposed to renewable energy initially. And then that sort of grows your knowledge base beyond just looking at corporate credit risk and looking at project finance and structured risk. And then that then turned into the broader infrastructure sector as well. So PPP projects, project and structured finance.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
PPP is a sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, it's a huge type of undertaking. But my question for you is, so you kind of fell into it, it seems. It's not like you were, driven to work in the energy sector, if I'm understanding correctly. And correct if I'm wrong. But I wanted to ask you a very specific question. Over the last 10 years, there's been this massive trend of ESG with sustainability in the mix. Now, lots of money has flowed into that, but do you think that is really driven by market demand, or is it somewhat of a political thing?
Yeah, I think I'd reframe that more broadly, and I think we have to sort of admit that energy is inherently political. And sort of if we look at post 71 when the US dollar was detached from gold, um, you know energy has been very much political in terms of it's the largest account item that goes between nation states, and how that trade is denominated in, what currency it's denominated in, is inherently political. There's a geopolitical angle to it as well in terms of energy security. So, whether Russian gas is denominated in euros, in US dollars, or comes via India in a different currency, that's inherently baked into the political dynamics of the day. It's definitely not just a sort of a neutral phenomenon.
So if we're going to read between the lines there and maybe extrapolate a little bit, are you suggesting that without the subsidies, renewable energy wouldn't be competitive?
Well, I think there's another step back there as well. I think the face value assumption is that government involvement or subsidies is what backstops renewable energy projects, and that might have been true many years ago in the initial stages. And I think the assumption that goes with that is that governments provide stability and they provide certainty, so investors can make long-term investment decisions. I think what I've actually observed working in the industry is actually counterintuitive to that. It's where governments actually introduce uncertainty. And so, without getting, too specific into specific details, I've seen instances where governments have introduced price caps that have prevented projects from realizing market prices when they're high. And I've also seen governments be too generous with the subsidies that they hand out initially, and then later go back and try and undo those subsidies and, find a administrative issue with a project to then reverse those subsidies. So, I mean, what both those examples do is that it introduces an element of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is not good for investors looking to make long-term decisions about where they allocate their capital. Ultimately, that's not good for the renewable industry either. So it's kind of perverse. I think what I've actually observed is that in recent years, the involvement of governments has actually introduced more uncertainty that's not supportive to renewable energy projects.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you mentioned that politics is kind of baked into it because oil is denominated in the reserve currency of the world. Let's just put it that way. Isn't the push for renewable, like wind or solar, kind of an attack on that? Would you position it that way? Because then it reduces the dependency on oil denominated in US dollars. I'm just curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think, the reality that's emerging is that very much we live in a multipolar world, and increasingly it's going to be even more multipolar. And energy is such a huge market, and it has such, different dynamics that it doesn't really stand up to sort of simplistic analysis as well. It's not just as simple as saying, here's OPEC and here's the US and there's everyone else. I think, what we're seeing now is that that the emerging sort of BRICS bloc is comprised of a lot of net producers of energy, and a lot of them will have different relationships to the US and the US dollar. So, it makes it very hard to predict what the future is going to look like. But other than to say that there's going to be multiple actors and they're going to have multiple motivations to, pursue particular energy policies and trade.
Just to move on a little bit towards nuclear. I mean, we've heard in recent days announcement from Starmer's Labour government in the UK that the UK will start looking again at building nuclear power stations. Obviously, they've fallen a long way behind Europe, and they're probably going to look a lot more closely at modular nuclear reactors. Now, for a long time, we've ignored nuclear as a clean form of energy. Why do you think that is?
I think it gets back to Ralph's initial question about politics as well. So, there's I've worked in the industry for a number of years now, and one thing I still can't understand is particular countries' positions to nuclear energy. And I can think of one in particular. And it's almost this sort of mental gymnastics or doublethink where you want to uphold one narrative at the same time, but it sort of ignores the ration and logic on the other hand. So what I mean by that is that there's an increased focus on low carbon energy, and nuclear would appear to be a low carbon form of energy.
Yeah.
Yet you sort of see nations that are proponents of low carbon transition, have also legislated closure of nuclear plants as well, to what would appear to be their detriment, with a number of sort of follow-on effects in terms of competitiveness for their industry, driven by the cost of energy. So that appears to be an own goal. It doesn't appear to be logical. Um, I don't have any sort of answers for that other than to sort of put forward some other follow-on questions in terms of, trying to understand where they're coming from. Is it about safety concerns? Then to me that doesn't make sense as well, because if I look at the country next door, has a lot of nuclear as well.
Mm.
Is it safety concerns that they don't trust themselves to operate the nuclear plants? We're saying that they don't trust themselves to avoid another Chernobyl sort of event.
Mm.
So it doesn't make sense. And then it doesn't make sense when you compound on top of that, that if that country also has coal plants, those coal plants have stayed on, but the nuclear ones have been legislated to shut down. So you try and take that argument on face value, and that, well, it's already been written into law and it can't be reversed. But I think, laws do change as well. I think where there's a political will, there's a way to change laws. I would have thought in the middle of an energy crisis would have been the time to revisit that. But, I think it's probably in the political interest to avoid a debate where, they're actually considering reversing those laws, and then to draw even more attention to the fact that they're not going to do that, because I think that sort of highlights the political element to those energy policy decisions. What those dynamics are. The three of us can speculate and theorize about it. How much tinfoil do you have?
Yeah.
But I think there's definitely a political element that otherwise doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, we can say the country, and I'm thinking Germany, for example, where France is still heavy nuclear. They've been doing okay, and energy prices, I don't believe, soared as much as, for example, Germany. I think they went through shutting down their nuclear reactors during the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and it caused like headwinds across the board. One thing I find quite ironic is that, as sound money advocates, we always advocate for the free market. And it seems with governments intervening with subsidies, caps on prices, the consequences of these actions are the misallocation of capital, which in this case, had we put all that money into nuclear, we would probably have seen better nuclear technology, cleaner nuclear technology, and safer nuclear technology. Is that something you would agree with, Justin, or do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I would take a step back again, and I would say it's very difficult to, and I don't know why anyone would want to be in the position to try and dictate or legislate to others how you can use energy or how energy should be generated. There's the ethical part of that in the first instance, but in the second instance, there's the practicality of it. How are you going to enforce that? So, Ralph, if you don't use energy the way that I want, or you don't generate it the way I want, you're going to hurt my feelings. Is that going to work? Is that going to be sort of enforceable? So I think you sort of have to take a step back and accept that countries and individuals and market participants are going to use, and they're going to generate energy however they see fit. And what you're going to end up with is, uh, you know, a multipolar sort of situation. So different countries will have a different energy mix. So some countries have been blessed with hydro resources, where most of their generation mix can be made out of hydro, that provides them with stable baseload power all year round. But there's other countries, that are major energy importers, and one example of that is Japan. Therefore they're much more exposed to the volatility in international energy markets. So the answer is going to be different for everyone, but I think what the answer looks like is that the the energy mix that you're moving towards in the future is not just going to be binary. It's not either or. It's not either oil and gas or it's not renewables. It's a mix. And I think even if you look at sort of the international energy projections, agency projections out for a number of decades, every country will have a different number of generation mix sort of sources in the future projections.
Yeah, I
Right.
definitely
So
don't want to hurt your feelings.
yeah, yeah. So we talked about uh, what the people want from a mix of energy, and we're gonna move on to what the people want from a type of money. And clearly, you're a Bitcoiner. It is interesting that you come from a renewable energy background and you're a Bitcoiner, given all the FUD around energy usage. So let's start with what sparked your interest in Bitcoin. Is there a sort of light bulb moment for you that you can point to?
There's probably different stages over the year, like over the years. So I think even pre-Bitcoin, I can remember being interested in how systems work, how money works. I think that's what initially drew me to banking and finance. And in the early years of YouTube, there was a video by someone called Paul Grignon, and the video series was called Money is Debt. And it was an animated video series. And already it was sort of getting into some of the problems that, went into the history of gold and then how, bank runs happened when, the goldsmiths eventually abused their trust of the depositors. So the problem was already formed even before Bitcoin came into existence. So you can imagine, how much I was kicking myself that it took me years to actually take a look at Bitcoin properly. And I will have to admit that, if you're working in finance, you have to overcome a certain amount of your own prejudices or your own ego about the way you identify with money, about your knowledge within it. So even this year, I see the same recycled FUD in newspapers. I see the Bitcoin is tulips article with the hyperbolic graph, which charts Bitcoin price versus tulips. And I can actually recall seeing that newspaper article back in 2017.
Mm.
So that got me back then as well. So I probably didn't take a proper look until, like many people, 2020, when we were all locked down and we all had time to think about what all this money printing meant. And I think the thing that spurred me further along was conceptualizing a $1 as 1 second, and then working out the difference in order of magnitudes from $1 million being 10 days to $1 billion, being 32 years. And 32 years isn't great. It means that when you print $1 billion, you're basically you're mortgaging the future of the next generation already in $1 billion. So that was 2008. But when we got to 2020 and the printing was in the trillions, I realized that a trillion is actually 32,000 years, and I think that definitely sent me further down the rabbit hole. So you know, even then, there's a journey. I don't think you sort of you don't get things straight away. It takes time for things to sink in. But I think the further I went down the rabbit hole, the particular aha moment I remember was actually learning about the difficulty adjustment. And for the layman, I'll try and explain it as simply as possible. But it's basically the part of the Bitcoin protocol that best combines energy, time, and the digital world, and it finds a way to combine all three to regulate the amount of time that the next block comes to, more or less every 10 minutes, which it's been doing for 16 years now. So I think when you sit and you reflect on that deeply, it's a combination of a number of different realms. That's kind of a mind-blowing moment. So that was definitely an aha moment for me.
Yeah, that's it's funny. Bitcoin, the aha moment happens so differently for every single person. There's always one component of it that sticks with someone and that drags them down the rabbit hole. And at the end of that rabbit hole, which is never ending, but as you go deeper, you start realizing how important it is. So I can relate. I'm sure Harris can relate because we both come from a traditional finance background, and Harris, having worked in the Islamic finance space, found a close tie between Bitcoin and Islam as well. In my case, it was a very high level of pain, which is basically the annihilation of the entire savings of my people. Uh, I'll jump to another question for you that relates to Bitcoin and your background. So, as someone who worked in TradFi myself, I had to unlearn a lot of the misconceptions I had about economics and finance because we're taught Keynesian economics, right? So printing is good, you need inflation to grow the economy, all that kind of stuff. But you worked in finance and in renewable energy. So there was this lens of, we need to find a cleaner way to generate energy. So, how did you overcome, or what are your thoughts about Bitcoin's energy consumption? Because in the headlines, we've heard every story about how Bitcoin is gonna, eat all the energy of the world and all the type of FUD that, mainstream media like to push out. So, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And how did you deal with that in the moment when you were learning about Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different angles you can sort of take with that one. So I think the first one is, the point I made earlier, who gets to decide how energy gets used and how it gets generated. I think if you ever find yourself in a position where you feel entitled to do that for other people, I think you need to stop and, revisit where you're coming from. If other people are sort of saying to you with confidence and certainty how energy should be used and how it should be generated, I think it's perfectly normal to be entirely skeptical or critical of, where that's coming from, particularly if it's coming from a place where that person gets on a private plane and flies to a place where other people who get on private planes meet and then tell everyone else how energy should be used and how it should be generated as well. So I think that's the first point. The second point is it actually true? So I think there's been a number of academic articles that have been debunked now for a number of years, and we've got the benefit of time to see how the projections weren't actually true, where they were projecting by this stage that Bitcoin mining was actually going to use more energy that existed in the world. So the last time I checked, it's about between 100 and 150 terawatt hours of like a global total that's about 160,000. So I think it's well under 1%. I think it's about 0.2 to 0.5%. But then it leads you to other questions. How much energy does gold mining use? How much energy does the legacy banking system use? How much energy does a military industrial complex that is needed to enforce that consensus used? Is that ESG friendly versus the alternative? So there's a number of ways you can approach that.
Even you can ask even more, because some people might say, well, we need the military complex, well, we need the banking system. But there are other things that you can point out. Do we need Christmas lights? Or is that just a waste of energy? So, I mean, the difference is you have to look at what it's actually doing. And the way I view it, when people tell me these type of arguments, I say, okay, but there is a unit of account or an asset that sits literally outside of the entire system you're familiar with. That in itself gives it value and would justify the 0.2%. It means that I like to view it as that 0.2% of energy is kind of that 0.2% of value that no one can take away from you. And,
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
start to think about that.
There's a very good book on this subject that looks at Bitcoin from a philosophical point of view. It's called Resistance Money. I really recommend it to people who are looking at this subject for the first time, and particularly for professionals who are looking at Bitcoin with an open mind, and they're not swallowing the FUD that we keep reading in the newspapers. And they say, well, what is this really about? And this book by Andrew Bailey and Craig Womka, there's a third author whose name I forget. They're professors of philosophy, so they use the philosophical tools of argument. And they say, what would a world look like with Bitcoin versus without Bitcoin? And the energy argument is one argument that they use. And they talk about, we attribute usefulness to things, and our use of energy and our view about whether it's energy wasteful or energy useful depends on whether we think that thing is useful to us or beneficial to us. So is YouTube good for us? Are washing machines good for us? Is an alternative monetary system good for us? And we think the answer is yes. Then we start looking at it on a more first principles basis. So that's a good book that I recommend to people. And I wanted to just follow up on this question because um, I often hear about the price spikes in energy and the energy crises across Europe and elsewhere. And I hear about Bitcoin being a way of stabilizing energy grids and monetizing excess power. So talk us through that. What does that mean? How does it work? And why could Bitcoin potentially be useful and energy efficient rather than the inefficient energy usage that we keep getting told about in the mainstream media?
Okay, so I'll take it back to energy grids and where we're at this point in time. So we're in a transition phase between a legacy energy model, which could be described as like a hub and spoke model, where you've got a centralized like a coal or a gas or a nuclear power station, and then all the little spokes that come off that. So the sort of energy grid that supports that sort of dynamic is different to the one that has more renewable energy on the grid. And that means wind farms and solar farms increasingly that are located at different points of the grid that produce power intermittently, when the sun shines or when the wind blows, variable. So what that introduces is a number of risks to grid stability that weren't there before. One of them is frequency, grid stability. And another problem is that there's also this concept of maximum demand. So grids are designed to basically have the capacity of the maximum demand point when the most power is being used, uh, not the least power being used. So the times when it's below that maximum, there's a lot of unutilized capacity as well. Just like in the middle of the day, if there's a lot of sun and there's a lot of wind, the market price for power could actually fall negative because there's an excess of power being distributed at the time. So, we're painting this picture of a grid that's in the middle of a transition between two phases. And right now, there's all these dislocations emerging. So, renewables, more than 10 years ago were very easy. You'd have a government offtake or a corporate offtake. It'd go for 15 or 20 years, and that was fine. You'd set and forget. But increasingly now, where the market has got to is that, projects, their investment case and their economics are much more underwritten by a merchant price forecast into the long term. And what the price of power is going to be in 10 or 15 or 20 years, your guess is as good as mine. But increasingly, what we're observing, even in the current year, is that there are more events that I talked about, like negative price hours, because there's an excess of power, or what we call in the industry capture price discount. So, too many wind farms producing wind at the same time. There's curtailment, which means that the grid infrastructure isn't capable of transmitting all the power that's generated. So the producers of the power have to actually curtail their output. So what all that does is it not only does it make the grid more unstable, it actually makes long-term investment in renewable projects more unstable as well. So where Bitcoin mining comes into it is that it seems like a natural complement to renewable energy in that, in one aspect, it can actually contribute to grid stability through it being a flexible demand load. It can switch on and it can switch off quickly, uh, depending on when the power price dictates. So when power price is low or negative, it makes sense that the Bitcoin miners are running. But where the power price is high, and the grid operators actually pay people to turn off. So they'll try and offer an industrial player, like a, say, aluminium smelter. They'll offer them a financial incentive to turn off. But a Bitcoin miner is a much more responsive and flexible version of that. So, you know, it could be argued that batteries do the same thing. But, as I said earlier, it's probably better not to take an absolute kind of view of it. It doesn't have to be either or binary. All those things like Bitcoin mining, like batteries, they're a way for renewable projects to add optionality. And from what I see, it's probably adding that optionality is actually going to be critical to their viability in the future.
Interesting. And one point I'd like to add, so I think it's a company, a Bitcoin mining company based out in Africa called Gridless. And what they've been doing is because the major problem in Africa is that a lot of people live in rural areas. So it's not worthwhile for the grid operator to connect to them and or to build infrastructure in those remote areas. So they don't have power most of the time. But Bitcoin miners have the ability, because they're so mobile, they've been going into these remote areas and using like mini dams and mini, hydro type of, lakes, rivers. And what they've been doing, they've been helping subsidize the renewable infrastructure project over time. So the actual utility company starts making money before the grid is actually connected to the residents. So that incentivizes from a social aspect. Also, it might be, I view it potentially, and I might be speculating too far, but I view Bitcoin mining as kind of the key to bring power to everyone in the world, no matter which area they are in, because it excels at cheap, remote, unused energy extraction. So it's just easy to plug in anywhere in the world. It's just a container with a few computer machines. If you haven't seen what it looks like, you should look it up because it's fascinating of how of a plug and play type of model it is. They come in already built in, everything is set up, the ventilation, all that. You just bring it in, it's like a huge container and just plug it into a generator and then there you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's thank you for walking us through that. That's very insightful. Uh, Wanted to ask you, so do you think you mentioned a very interesting word? You said Bitcoin mining complements general utility companies and provides this very apex form of demand response. Let's speculate just a little bit, given your experience. How likely, given the new political administration in the United States. Let's just start there. In Europe, maybe less likely, but typically what happens in the United States over time starts flowing to Europe, hits the Middle East, and then the rest of the world. Do you think all these energy grids, because this is kind of happening in Texas, right? With so many Bitcoin miners connected to ERCOT, because over there, it's, I think, an independent grid of sorts. I don't know the exact terminology for it, but it seems to have been creating case studies on how Bitcoin miners are helping during extreme situations with like extreme winter. Do you think in the US, let's speculate here, given the new administration, we're going to see a lot of utility companies, a lot of energy companies add Bitcoin mining, not just from demand response, but also to increase sustainability because there's technology to capture methane gas rather than flare it into the atmosphere. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, Bitcoin as a ESG friendly. Some people say it's the only way we're going to become carbon neutral, and we could become carbon neutral if we just plug them into all the flaring of methane all around the world, and we'd already be carbon. Any thoughts on that? Because we're trying to debunk one of the biggest FUDs about Bitcoin, which is it's bad for the energy. And FYI, if people don't know, Bitcoin mining has over 50% renewable energy mix in terms of its use. So it's one of the most green carbon neutral uses of energy.
Yeah, there's a few different threads in that are quite interesting. I think one of them that you touched on is the potential pairing of Bitcoin mining with grid operators as well. I think at some stage it becomes sort of it's an existential issue for them as well. So grid operators are still very much heavily regulated. In order to update them, there's a lengthy regulatory approvals process before transmission can get upgraded. How that's going to work in the same time that there's a pipeline of renewable energy projects waiting to be added to the project, to the grid, there's a mismatch there. So what you described earlier when you talked about gridless or when you talked about ERCOT is it's a situation where there's little or no centralized government planning. It's a market mechanism that actually results in a more efficient outcome. I think that's a particularly interesting idea, and I think that's one that if there's energy professionals or industry participants who already haven't looked into it, I think that's rather than providing you with answers, I would say I'd encourage you to take a look at those projects and what's happening in those markets and come up with your own set of questions that follow on from that rather than sort of prescribing an answer for you. The other one that you touched on with ESG and gas flaring, that's a huge one that sort of gets sidestepped sometime. I think You can sort of take it both ways in terms of if you want to buy wholesale into the role of carbon, that the role that carbon plays or the role that carbon doesn't play. But I think what's sort of undeniable is that that gas flare is otherwise uneconomic waste on one hand, or at the worst, it's actually a negative externality that needs to be mitigated. So whichever view you sort of take on carbon, if you're using that to then, monetize that otherwise wasted energy or that negative externality, I can't see how that's a bad thing unless you're actually opposed to the underlying asset itself. And then you're sort of in the realm of mental gymnastics again.
Yeah. Okay, so Justin, we're going to force you to make some predictions now. Just fast forward 10 years. Do you see Bitcoin as part of a global energy strategy?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go out and say that I think it's kind of inevitable because I think first principle, if you look at what Bitcoin is, it's a way to monetize energy that wasn't previously monetized.
Mhm.
Uh, so it's kind of inevitable that it will play a role in the future, and particularly the way that if you're watching geopolitics and the way that game theory is playing out, I think everything is pointing towards at some stage in the future, after we've tried every other possible alternative that's failed, um, we sort of land on a neutral reserve asset that can sort of coordinate international trade. But how that, how long that frame of time takes, I don't know. And what it looks like exactly on the other side, I can't say. But at some point, I think the card is going to be played where a major energy producing nation actually says, I want to denominate my energy trade in Bitcoin. I think that is inevitable at some point. I don't know when that happens.
That might shake things up globally, but you never know. I mean, the United States seems to be headed towards a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Uh, the states themselves have been putting in bills to introduce their own Bitcoin strategic reserves. There's a bunch of countries across Europe, Eastern Europe, I think, that are considering it as well. So I don't see why not. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the line, we might see a complementary industry, which I think by that time, energy and Bitcoin mining will be the same industry. They're just an extra tool within it. So that's amazing. And another speculative in 10 years or 5 years, let's not go that far, in 5 years from now, given the trend we're heading in, institutions came in 2024, 2025, the talk of the town is potential sovereign states' involvement in Bitcoin. In 5 years' time, do you think we'll still be having debates about the energy mix of Bitcoin, about its effects on the environment? Because it seems as more and more of these smaller projects and these case studies flourish with ERCOT, with gridless, with, I think Exxon is capturing uh, methane and carbon flaring using Bitcoin miners. I mean, we're building a case, and at one point the data will speak for itself. When do you foresee that the FUD around Bitcoin energy consumption will no longer be an issue? I mean, you could say never because there's always going to be people who, like you said, just politically are going to be against it. But in general,
Yeah, I think it'll probably disappear in a way that you probably won't even notice it disappears. There'll be, if game theory sort of plays out, there'll be too many other things that are actually more front of mind that captures people attention. That actually what the so-called concerns about Bitcoin mining and energy use will sort of start to fall away. So, the comparison I think about is the internet. The people that sort of doubted the internet and the role it was going to play initially, it was going to be no more significant than the fax machine. I mean, those sort of critiques, they just sort of faded away. People that sort of didn't understand what the business model of Amazon was in the early days, it just sort of fell away. No one ever went back and said, "Oh, I was wrong about this, this, and this." They just sort of moved on, and they just started probably using Amazon themselves. So I expect the people that probably were, right now the loudest sort of critics of Bitcoin mining and the energy usage, I expect in the future at some point, out of necessity, they'll just be forced to adopt Bitcoin usage, and at that point, you probably won't hear much at all.
So, what's you now straddle that line between TradFi and Bitcoin. What would be your closing advice to investment professionals and energy experts on, the future role of Bitcoin?
I think it's imperative if you're a fiduciary or you're an agent, you're taking your client's money to make decisions for them as a fiduciary or otherwise. I think it's incumbent on you to ask questions and learn more about it. I think questions are much more productive than narratives. So there's a multitude ways in. You touched on some earlier, Harris, with that book. For people that are, professionals in the renewables and ESG space, there's a bunch of academic research out there that's been collated by Daniel Batten. I encourage you to look at that. If it's, academic research is what it takes to sort of spark your curiosity. For people that were in debt markets or fixed income, there's work by someone called Greg Foss, who was a long time sort of a bond trader as well. I'd encourage people to look at that. For anyone that's into structured finance or markets, if you've been living under a rock and you don't know who Michael Saylor is or MicroStrategy, go have a look at what's happening there. And you'll naturally have a set of follow-on questions that will lead you to somewhere that sort of improves your understanding.
Amazing. Yeah. And I mean, the key to that, and I always say that before I start talking about Bitcoin at like a gathering or around my friends, is before I say anything, I say, just have an open mind.
Mm.
Just have an open mind, and we've been proven wrong. All of us have many times. We thought something was not gonna work out, and then it ended up working out. You said, yeah, no, the government's never gonna allow Bitcoin to survive. The government, look at them now. They're talking about holding it in their strategic reserve. Like no one knows. So just have an open mind, and I think this is true for everything in life in general. It's important to take things one step at a time and don't take up the narrative. Typically, the narratives are filled with holes. And I think it's everyone's responsibility as a professional to be curious and to seek their own truth. Like do the research. You could agree with certain things. You don't have to become a maximalist or agree with every component, but the idea is that, there is some value there for everyone. And that's what I try to say to everyone. Ideally, that's like what I'd like to share with our audience. Justin, thank you so much for today. Where are you? You're in Bangkok right now, right?
I'm in Bangkok right now, yeah.
Nice. This is a global podcast. So, got Harris in the UK, myself in Dubai, and Bangkok. Again, thank you so much for your time today, Justin. Really appreciate your insights, especially on the renewable side and energy side. We don't meet a lot of people within that space. For some reason, they're not very public or outspoken. So, thank you for coming on the show. And Harris, as always, thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys. It's been
guys.
a pleasure.
Cheers.